So, hello everyone. Welcome to the University of Canberra and welcome to the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance. My name is Selen Ercan and I'm a professor and currently the director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here at the University of Canberra. And I will be moderating today's conversation. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. This event is the third and the final part of the Digital Media and the Public Sphere seminar series. It is co-hosted by our center, the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, and the News and Media Research Center at the University of Canberra, in collaboration with the Digital Media Research Center at the Queensland University of Technology. Our aim with this seminar series is actually simple. We want to talk and learn from each other, as we feel we are talking about the same set of problems, but often use different frameworks, methods, terminology to understand and address the issues contemporary democracies face. Today, we want to focus on the concept of the public sphere, as it's a central concept that both media and communication scholars, as well as deliberative democrats, are interested in and are using in their research. Our speakers who are in conversation with each other today may not need any further introduction, but we have Professor John Dryzek. John is a professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here at the University of Canberra. And he was an ARC Laureate Fellow here at UC between 2014 and 2020. The Laureate Fellowship went from John to Axel. Axel Bruns is a professor at the Digital Media Research Center at the Queensland University of Technology, and he's currently an ARC Laureate Fellow. So we brought two ARC Laureate Fellows together, and we will be asking them difficult questions. So in terms of how we structured today's conversation, I will first of all ask a couple of questions to Axel and John, and then they will ask questions to each other because, as I said, today's event is a part of a sort of 3 weeks conversation we've been having. So they have lots of questions to each other as well. This will be followed by the Q&A here in the room as well as online. So we have online participants as well, and our research assistant, Matt Harris, will be moderating the online discussion. And can we please ask the online participants to mute their microphones and put their questions in the chat box? Matt will be collecting them and then asking. So this event is being filmed and it will be uploaded on YouTube because we feel like there's a broader audience who are interested in this conversation, and we would like to make this recording available to anyone who is interested in the set of issues and questions we are interested in. Please identify yourself if you don't want to be filmed, and identify yourself to Krista, who could take care of it if you don't want to be filmed. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you very much, Axel, for coming to Canberra all the way from Brisbane, and welcome to you, John, as well. I am very excited to be moderating this conversation today, because you both work in the areas that I am personally very interested in as well, and so I have lots of questions to you. I want to reflect a little bit about on your individual presentations from the previous weeks. And my sense was that Axel spent a lot of time in his seminar trying to specify what the problem is that the democracies are facing. And rather than spending time on the solution side of things, John spent some time on thinking through what the problem is as well, and he gave us a really good framework about the things we should worry about and other things we shouldn't be worrying about. But also spend a lot of time thinking about the solutions, like what from here, what, if anything, can deliberative democratic approach offer to resolve the issues we are facing in our contemporary democracies. I guess in my thinking, I want to bring these two seminars together, and I want us today to briefly also talk about what the problem is, if we agree on the problem, and think about the solution. So this is my way of bringing our two speakers together. So I want to start by summarizing what I understood, what you talked about in your seminar, Axel. And please feel free to interfere and say, no, this wasn't my argument. You didn't get it right. And to make it short, I might be simplifying your sophisticated argument. So please excuse me if I am doing that. So Axel, you talked a lot about the polarization, about different kind of polarization. And you have refuted the famous filter bubbles argument and said the filter is in our heads. Don't blame the digital platforms for polarization. Instead, try to understand and specify when and how polarization becomes harmful. So you shifted the focus for me to the individual agency rather than the digital platforms in our efforts to understand polarization. And then you also talked about the hyperconnectivity. And you have argued that polarization can be fueled by hyperconnectivity. So connectivity, we assume, is good for democracy. The more connected we are, the better it is. But maybe we should stop and think about the type of connectivity. And you have identified hyperconnectivity as one possible problem area that we should be focusing on in our efforts to understand and address polarization. And one particular type of polarization you have talked about is the affective polarization. And this is the tendency for partisans to dislike and distrust those from the other party. I'm very much interested in this kind of polarization. I'm coming originally from Turkey. I have a lived experience of affective polarization. We are watching this kind of polarization now during the current Turkish elections as well. So this is my personal interest. But also, as a deliberative Democrat, I am interested in the affective polarization because deliberative Democrats tend to not to talk about the emotional side of things. So, if I understand it correctly, affective polarization is a kind of polarization that is more difficult to deal with because it might not have any rational ground. So, I want to ask you both how we should approach this form of polarization, both empirically and normatively. And when I'm talking about the affective polarization as one specific kind of problem our democracies are having, John, I want to turn to you and ask to what extent the kind of discursive bridges you talked about in your talk could work in the face of affective polarization. So this is my way of bringing the problem and a solution together, because John Dryzek talked about diabolical times and the difficulty democracies are facing in those times. And he also talked about polarization. He identified multiple other problems rather than focusing on one core problem like Axel did. And John, in his talk, argued that it may be difficult to deliberate in current contemporary democracies because of the sort of the extremism, rise of extremism, because of we have the climate denialists, and he identified different kind of profiles that could be harmful for democracy. But then he said, but it is still possible if you're able to establish discursive bridges across difference. So my question to you both, how can we think about effective polarization as a problem and discursive bridges as a solution? I want to start with Axel. And Axel, please feel free to add anything else that I might have missed from in my summary of your argument or key positions that you have elaborated.
Thank you. I think that's a really, I mean, it is a really good summary, I think, of what I was talking about as well. And just one thing, because you mentioned digital platforms as well, and my argument that they're not to blame, that the whole filter bubbles and echo chambers, the argument is totally overblown. I do want to also make sure that it's clear that there are still other things that we can certainly blame the platforms for. So I'm not trying to free them of all responsibility. There's certainly much more that they can do, for instance, to police hate speech, to police problematic content, and so on. So I'm not saying that the platforms are totally blameless in everything that's going on, but filter bubbles and echo chambers are the last thing that we can blame them for, because that's just, they're really just myths. So that's just a very brief clarification on that one. But on the question of effective polarization, yes, you're right. And the way that I understand effective polarization, there's of course a number of different approaches perhaps to it as well, is really that there can still possibly be some kernel of a rational sort of starting point perhaps, so that people might start out being simply having differences of opinion on a particular issue or a set of particular issues, but that builds up gradually, for instance, into an identity, a self-identity, an identity of others, that they connect with at a much more emotional level rather than at a purely rational level. And so you end up with really a much more identity-based form of polarization. And that's much harder to overcome. And I think the answer, in a sense, to how to deal with that, how to respond to that, might be to try and reverse that process, actually. So to step back from the comprehensive identity of being, in the obvious of US case, a Republican or a Democrat or a MAGA Trump voter or whatever, to step back from that all-encompassing identity and actually to start to move back to talking about specific issues and to find common ground there. So while you're right that I certainly have not yet offered any solutions, because frankly that's a reflection of where my project is at as well at the very start, that for me is one of the possibilities that I'm certainly interested in exploring. That we might move away, or we might break through perhaps that question of effective polarization by not connecting everything back to people's comprehensive identities, but really to start thinking about specific issues, specific topics, and find perhaps a way to restart conversations on those. So let's see, what would be a useful example here? Again, if we look at the US sort of case of Republicans versus Democrats, obviously, if you simply have a conversation on that basis and people are very invested in adhering to that particular identity, the conversation is not going to go very far. You've got a hardcore Trump fan and a hardcore, whatever, Biden fan, perhaps, then those two are probably not going to have much of a conversation with each other that leads to any kind of constructive dialogue. But if you start talking about, well, what should happen with the debt default? What should happen with any kind of specific current issue? Then it might be possible to actually start to have much more meaningful discussions if you try and disconnect that from that higher level of identity that they're very effectively connected with. So that to me is I think links very much to what I understood from John about these kind of questions of where you can build bridges, where you can have those sort of bridging debates, and possibly actually who might be the right people to create those bridges as well. So picking out these kinds of topics where there is perhaps a meaningful debate to be had, possibly at a very local and a very low-key level. So even more down to the ground, really just who's going to fix that pothole or whatever at the local level or whatever else it might be, some kind of issue that ideally you can, if you like, depoliticize and disconnect from that sort of very, very strongly felt identity. That might be the starting point for these sorts of attempts to overcome effective polarization. I do also need to say, and I said this in the talk, that not all forms of polarization are necessarily problematic. So people having identities, people connecting with their identities, and expressing those is not in itself a problem. The problem becomes when that overshadows everything and when it undermines any kind of meaningful debate. So the fact that there is some effective polarization because of the strong emotional connection that people have to particular issues or particular identities, that in itself isn't necessarily a problem, as long as you still accept the right of someone else to have a different identity and a different emotional connection to the issues and the things that they're interested in. But when that no longer happens, and when people are essentially denying each other's right to exist or to pursue their political or other views, then we're having a problem. So we've also got to be careful not to say all forms of polarization, all forms of effective polarization are necessarily bad. Some emotion in public debate is not necessarily a bad thing. But when it gets misdirected and turns particularly into hate, then that's a problem.
Yes, thank you. I find the question of identity is one of the trickiest questions in democratic theory and practice. And we as scholars, we might say, let's leave your identity aside and focus on the issues, or let's focus on what brings us together, what we have in common rather than what differs us. But we could suggest these solutions, but it's very tricky in practice, because for people, this is their identity offers them a lens through which they form their opinions, through which they form their preferences. And I find it tricky myself to say, especially if identities are connected with disadvantages, power relations, marginalizations, you want to put your identity forward, you want to amplify that rather than silence it and try to have a rational debate with someone. So I find it difficult to validate one's identity at the same time, but then maintain a reasonable discourse. It's a difficult balance, and I would be against rejecting sort of, leave your identity aside, it's irrelevant now kind of position. And I also fear at the same time that if we are depoliticizing identities, like don't we end up saying we are all human beings? And what does this do to our identities? And what does it help with our political debates as well? Just to sort of use a sort of super general concept, we are all human beings, it doesn't matter who you are. So I find it, I understand your position, but I find it difficult to achieve in practice, and depoliticization is not necessarily the right.
And I'm not saying ignore identity altogether. So because that, you're right, that would be really problematic, particularly when it comes to issues where there is a long-term, very deeply set inequality that is identity-based, for instance. I mean, this is an article by Daniel Price and Sharon McGregor that came out just recently that talks about the fact that on certain issues, polarization might be perfectly justified by the deep inequality that exists. an example that they're using is Black Lives Matter, for instance. There is a long history of racial discrimination in the US and elsewhere. They talk about the US case particularly. We can't just ignore that and say, well, let's just put that to one side and talk about these issues in a totally abstract, emotionless way. That's just not possible. And so if you have a conflict between white supremacists and mainstream society, we can't just kind of ignore that kind of identity-based conflict, for instance, and kind of just step past it. So I'm certainly not saying we must ignore identity altogether. I think where it becomes difficult to move forward is if how can I put this best? Where it becomes difficult to move forward is, I think, when we use these identities as a kind of a catch-all in the debate. So it still needs to be possible, I guess, to argue from the point of your own identity, but without denying the other's right to exist. I will make an exception here, and John and I have talked a little bit about this before as well. I will make an exception here, obviously, if you're arguing with someone who is very actively denying your right to exist. There is no argument, there is no really meaningful debate to be had with a white supremacist, essentially, or other hate groups, essentially. So that it will be very difficult to have any kind of meaningful deliberation with someone who isn't actually willing to have a meaningful deliberation. But when we talk more about the center of society, then certainly differences of identity and effectively loaded differences of identity should not be a barrier to still trying to have a meaningful deliberation between those two sides.
Thank you. Thanks, Axel. John, turning to you, thinking about the effective polarization as a problem, and thinking about the idea of discursive bridges you emphasized in your talk, and from a deliberative democracy perspective. So what do you think? What extent the effective polarization is an issue in our contemporary democracies, and how do you see the discursive bridges idea working in the face of effective polarization?
Okay. There's a lot to react to in everything that Selen and Axel have already been discussing. So effective polarization, how that relates to identity differences seems to be a big question. Effective polarization, I mean, the term effective suggests that it does have an emotional content, and Selen suggested earlier that deliberative Democrats have traditionally ignored the role of emotions. I'm not sure that's necessarily completely true. I had a look at the index of the Oxford Handbook of Deliberative Democracy that was published a few years ago, and yesterday, and noticed that there were 12 entries for emotions in the index, so not completely ignored. And I think if there is a standard position amongst deliberative Democrats, it's probably that reason and emotion can be entwined. So I think effective polarization is only partly about emotions. I think, as Axel suggested, that dislike of the other side may actually be initially for good reasons. I mean, it can become more intense as in a matter of identity. But even identity conflicts don't mean that all is necessarily lost. And here we can look at there's a literature on deliberative democracy in deeply divided societies, which has been around for almost 20 years or so. And this, I mean, there are different positions in this literature, but a lot of it is really about trying to figure out how to build bridges across identity differences. And one of those was actually indicated by Axel when he suggested that maybe you can get people with different identities talking about common practical problems. And I think Selen suggested, well, maybe isn't that just avoiding the identity issues completely? I'm not sure it's necessarily either or. So if we there's an example I used a while ago from Northern Ireland, where there's a deep identity conflict, deeply ingrained in history between Catholics, Republicans on one side, Protestant Unionists on the other. And one way to, and this was actually done a while ago, to organize interchange across the two sides was rather than just saying, okay, well, let's deliberate the sovereignty issue, whose country is this? That's a big identity question. But how about starting with sort of more practical questions? And one of those was policing. Now, policing is related to the big identity conflict, but it also plays out on the ground in communities. So it's a way of talking about a practical problem that does connect to the big identity conflict. And instead of starting here with questions of sovereignty, whose country is this, you start with very practical, related questions at the local level. And then maybe you can sort of build into dialogue about those big identity questions. So in terms of discursive bridges, I think the idea here is maybe you can't sort of reach hardline extremists, leaders of the Proud Boys or whatever, but a lot of the people in the vicinity of that sort of extremism are not necessarily unreachable through deliberative means. And I think those people, if you like, the reachable, not quite extreme, is more important to think about. They're more important to think about when it comes to the construction of discursive bridges. And finally, let me just, in terms of solutions to effective polarization, I was just reading a book that's published this year by Matthew Lewandowski called Our Common Bonds, Using What Americans Share to Help Bridge the Partisan Divide. It's all about how to confront effective polarization. And what he suggests is essentially three, well, I would call them discursive bridges. He doesn't use that language. One would be a stress on a common identity as Americans, that different people on different sides of the divide have. Second, the kind of social networks that exist across party lines, involving friends, co-workers, neighbors, and so forth, and recognizing that that those things don't necessarily all map onto partisan divisions. I mean, in a deeply divided society, something like the Northern Ireland case that I was talking about, they would probably coincide with the identity divisions, but that's not necessarily the case. And then the idea, also the third idea, is that there may be common ground on some issues, and this relates to the question of maybe trying to find issues on which are not necessarily, they don't directly map onto the identity divide. So all that's by way of suggesting that effective polarization of the sort we see, say, between Republicans and Democrats in the US is historically perhaps not as bad as some of the deep divides we have seen in deeply divided societies. But there are ways of thinking about bridging across those divides, and if they can work in those sorts of deeply divided settings, they can work when it comes to contemporary political polarization too.
Okay, yes. Thanks, John, for bringing discursive bridges in connection with the effective polarization. I'm sure there are other questions in the room or online on this topic, but because of the time constraints, I'm moving on to the next topic, next set of questions I want to ask to Axel and John. So my second question is on the topic of complexity. And John talked about the lack of argumentative complexity in the contemporary democracies. Again, starting with Axel, can you please unpack this kind of problem a bit and its implications for the public sphere? I'm here particularly interested in knowing if there has been any time in our democracies where the public sphere featured more argumentative complexity than today. Was it the Habermasian cafe houses? And so how should we understand the desirable kind of complexity in the public sphere, and what exactly you mean that we don't see this at the moment? And please feel free also to add how you as a scholar of communication, understand, study both empirically and theoretically the argumentative complexity.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think it's not necessarily purely at a historical level, but of course you might have more and less complex arguments coexisting at any one point in history as well. And the question really is what the balance is. So the what I and what my colleagues talk about when we talk about this question of argumentative complexity is in essence the reduction of really complex topics to some very basic slogans, key terms, ways of describing the world or ways of calling for action or proposing action on certain topics. I mean, we've had any number of examples of that in recent times, but it's the sort of the famous sort of three-word slogans of election campaigns, for instance, and that's of course where they always happen, where always some very complex topics get reduced to, simple slogans that can be used in campaigning. That happens at different times to different extents and with different parties to different extents in history as well. The Donald Trump build the wall kind of argument or whatever, for instance, to say, well, this is the solution to everything that ails us, just build the wall. Or, of course, the cherry picking of particular factoids of information in order to make a much bigger argument that isn't supported by the facts. So the cherry picking of the one study that says, yes, the vaccine can occasionally have some side effects, to saying vaccines are bad, you shouldn't take them. You can pick whatever topic you like, basically, but it's the reduction of a much more complex kind of question, like, what do we do about COVID, to some very basic solutions that can offer, take ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, don't get vaccinated because vaccines are bad or whatever, any of those sorts of things. So there are a number of different rhetorical strategies that can be used, obviously, to do this. It might be the cherry picking, it might be the just focusing on one or a handful of specific aspects and ignoring the rest. And then, of course, amplifying that to a point where that's all that's visible. So that's the move of reducing complexity in your argument, in your discussion. And in many ways, this is not something new. This is something that's been recognized, of course, about populist rhetoric a lot. That simple solutions, simple scapegoats, of course, are also picked in the process. So that's really what I think we mean by the reduction of discursive complexity. That's always been a feature, I think, of politics, of political debate at any one point in time. It's how much it's being done, it's how much essentially certain political leaders can get away with it as well. That's, I think, what's varied over time. We've had, of course, other periods where populists have been incredibly successful. Well before the present moment. And we've had times when that's then also fallen flat on its face, and people said, actually, that's not really the solution. The world is much more complex, and we need much more complex solutions for that environment as well. So it comes and goes, and it ebbs and flows. I don't think it's something that's really unique about the current moment. But what may be somewhat different at the present moment and in the sort of present environment is that it's also a reaction to that hyperconnectivity that you've mentioned, and I've mentioned in my talk as well, that of course at a time when we are hyperconnected, where we've got an abundance of information, an abundance of different views to choose from around the world on whatever topic you like, that it is very seductive to be given a simple solution. Don't want to work out how to protect yourself against COVID, find something or someone to blame for what the causes of it are, or find an easy kind of answer to what you should do about it. At a time when I'm overwhelmed and when I'm fearful and when I'm concerned about what's going on in the world, that's very attractive, of course. And that goes for challenges around climate change, that goes for any other kind of political challenge you might want to name as well. So it's possibly heightened more at this present moment than it has been for some time, because we are overwhelmed by the wealth of information, the wealth of ideas, the wealth of potential solutions, and frankly, the wealth of problems in the world as well. So I think that's what's driving the rise of populism, particularly at the present moment. And I think I'm right in saying, again, there's empirical work that needs to be done there, that populism, the presence of populism has in the world overall has been higher recently than it has been over the last few decades. But I'd be very happy to be corrected on that as well, if someone else studies.
And when you think about when we think about who is responsible for the lack of argumentative complexity, you mentioned the political leaders. Like, can you say something more on this? Like, who should be tackling the lack of argumentative complexity in the contemporary public space?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there is, of course, the traditional role for journalism is to hold political leaders to account and to question the narratives that they offer. That's also become more difficult because, again, the diversity and the variety of media that are available is also much greater, I think, globally now than it has ever been. There is also, I think, a growth in political strategies, in political communication strategies that make use of that. I mean, we saw the Donald Trump town hall, for instance, with CNN just last week, I guess it was. And one of the strategies that he's used there, but that he's been using throughout his political career, is what, and I have to thank my colleague Dan Angus for alerting me to this, what's called the Gish Gallop, which is basically to spew so many falsities and make so many false claims so quickly that no journalist can fact check that anymore, even with the best of intentions. I mean, the New York Times, bless them, has run since 2017, I think, a list of all of Donald Trump's lies, and that's a massive investment of someone's time. I don't know that it helps much, other than just as a showpiece, but that is one of the strategies of populists, to just throw out so many falsehoods that no one can fact check that anymore. And so we are, I think, at a point where, yeah, it's very difficult to counter that if someone wants to embrace that sort of approach. But also, of course, fact checking itself is not enough, because so much of what's being offered by populist politicians isn't something that can easily be fact checked as false or true. It's simply picking things out of context and presenting them in a highly biased way. So journalism has a role to play, but journalism is itself overwhelmed, underfunded, and has many problems of its own.
John, to you on the topic of complexity and the problem of lack of argumentative complexity in the contemporary public sphere. So what do you think about this problem? Who is responsible and how to tackle it?
Right. I'm not sure there's ever any golden age when argumentative complexity reigned and problems were tackled effectively. Also, I think we can also look here at what psychologists have called integrated complexity, which is, it's related but not identical to argumentative complexity. The basic idea of integrated complexity is that it requires both differentiation and integration. So differentiation would be the clarification of different points of view, perspectives, discourses, call them what you like, and actually even polarization across different positions might even help there. But then integration requires bringing together sort of different perspectives on complex issues, as opposed to the simple assertion of slogans like "Build a Wall," "Make America Great Again," or whatever. I think so. Rather than sort of looking back on some golden age, I think what we should do is actually look at particular cases and try and figure out, well, when did political systems do a reasonably good job of coping with a complex problem? When did they do a poor job? And I think, one obvious comparison here would be two referendums from the UK, the one on the independence referendum in Scotland versus the Brexit referendum in the UK as a whole. And it's very striking there that the quality of debate deliberation was so much higher in Scotland for the independence referendum than for the Brexit referendum. So the question is, well, why the Brexit referendum seemed to be dominated by misinformation, lies, and simple slogans, and that's not the case for the Scottish independence referendum, where you had sort of really meaningful public deliberation about what the future direction of Scotland should be. So I think it's worth looking at those sorts of comparisons to try and figure out why do you get effective integrated complexity in one case but not in the other. I would say that as time goes on, problems are perhaps becoming more complex. And why is that? Well, hyperconnectivity, globalization. We think of an issue like climate change, which is global, interconnected with all kinds of other issues. So I think the complexity of a number of serious problems is growing, but at the same time, politicians such as Trump have figured out how to flourish by, as Axel suggested, just delivering this sort of a non-stop parade of simple slogans, falsities, appeals to identities in response. And so you've got this sort of divergence between seemingly more complex problems and then an environment in which these sorts of politicians can flourish.
Thank you. Thanks, John. So the last set of questions that I will be asking before opening the floor to Q&A and invite John and Axel to ask questions to each other is on the future of the public sphere, bringing us back to the main topic of today. So I want to ask you, starting with you, Axel, how do you imagine the future of the public sphere, taking into consideration the current developments, good or bad, negative or positive? What are some issues and threats that we can detect and try to address today for future-proofing the public sphere?
A nice, easy question. I mean, it's something. Look, my focus in my research has been very much on digital media, and so I think I'll focus on that. And for me, there is something interesting that's been going on in the digital media space over the last few decades, which is this sort of expansion and contraction in the range of platforms where public discourse, public communication takes place. We started out with a multitude of different bespoke spaces, lots of people starting up their blogs and so on and kind of contributing in some way to public debate, more or less informed contributions, I guess it has to be said. Then we moved to more centralized kind of spaces in the end, Facebook and Twitter and others came along, but particularly Facebook and Twitter came along and they were sort of the big platforms where public debate happened, again, for better or for worse, but certainly where a lot of this was kind of concentrated, and particularly, it has to be said, with Twitter, was very much in public view, really a globally public space where debate happened, where movements started. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the Arab Spring. It's not that they were there because of those platforms, but they were very visible on those platforms. So one of the things that is certainly happening right now is a kind of decentralization with the decline of Twitter and Elon Musk, obviously, and the way that's being overrun by all sorts of dodgy accounts and is no longer policed and moderated in any kind of way, with the decline to an extent also of Facebook as really as a central platform, with people moving away from that, the rise of other things coming along. I mean the Instagrams and WhatsApps and TikToks, but also then Telegram and all sorts of other platforms, Mastodon, of course, as well. So one of the things I'm currently really thinking through is, well, what effect will that have? Donald Trump didn't become present because of Twitter, but used Twitter very effectively as a public communication tool that was to some extent bypassing mainstream media. Now, he could go back to Twitter. He hasn't yet, and Twitter is no longer the thing that it was back in 2016. So how will, I guess, the Trump campaign look in 2024 if he's trying to run it from Truth Social? Where no one other than him really grows and no one really wants to be, basically. So what does that sort of reconfiguration of the digital public spaces that we have do to political campaigning, I guess, in the first place, in that context or in others, but also to public debate more broadly? How will the next Black Lives Matter or the next Me Too actually emerge if it doesn't, utilize the hashtag system on Twitter, for instance, that makes it so immediately visible to journalists? Where will journalists and news organizations actually be if they have to now be on Mastodon and on TikTok and on this and this and that? How does that work? There's a real reconfiguration, I think, and I don't want to be, I don't want to stray into technological determinism here, because it's not that. It's how these platforms are being used, obviously, by both institutions as well as individuals. That, I think, is the bigger question. But as the kind of digital public sphere is reconfiguring with these shifts in the platforms that are available in the way that they're being used, what impact does that have on both domestic as well as global public communication? I think there's a really interesting question here, and I frankly can't see that future yet, because there are so many different moving parts, including what continues to happen at Twitter, including what continues to happen at some of the other established platforms like Facebook and so on, but also what other platforms are coming along and how quickly can they establish themselves and attract any kind of global audience, and how are they configuring their moderation scheme and all these sorts of things. So that's one of the really fascinating questions for me, because it will have an impact on how public debate, how public communication, how the public sphere works, basically. But I think we're in for a period of increased fragmentation with all the potentially positive as well as negative implications that might have.
Thanks. John, your thoughts on the future of the public sphere?
Right. Well, maybe I'll emphasize the non-digital aspects, because it's obviously the digital public sphere is Axel's territory. Looking ahead, looking at the present, but also looking ahead, we can see a lot of challenges which aren't necessarily reducible to the sort of things that Axel just talked about. And some of these are ongoing. Simply rising inequality, going along with plutocracy, all the gains from economic growth just accruing to a tiny percentage at the top. I mean, that sort of growing inequality, I think, has some massive consequences for the public sphere. What else do we see? The abandonment of the working class by parties of the centre-left, as exemplified, say, by the Clintons' Democratic Party in the US. That's in some ways a sort of a crisis of political representation as an aspect of the crisis of democracy. The accompanying decline of the welfare state and the safety net it provides, and the material security it provides. Again, that's implications for the public sphere and the material underpinnings of communication in that sphere. And then also one thing that I've done a lot of in another contexts, which I haven't mentioned today so far, is the possibility of catastrophic state shifts in the Earth system, and what effect that will have. Not just climate change, but all the other aspects of Earth system change, in which climate change is just one manifestation. I've written a lot about that, including in a book a few years ago with Jonathan Pickering on the politics of the Anthropocene, how politics will look in emerging epoch of instability in the Earth system. So these are looking ahead. I mean, these are all sort of massive ongoing changes which threaten to become still more extreme in the future. And if we have an impoverished public sphere, an increasingly impoverished public sphere that faces those, then I think we're in real trouble. In terms of how to address all these problems, well, that's I mean, in a sense, that's I would say the whole program of deliberative democracy as a program for the reinvigoration of political systems as being well, just one, not necessarily the sole, but one very important category of response to that. Maybe that's all I'll say, rather than going into all the details of that program.
Yes, thanks, John. Considering the time left, I will have to reduce the number of questions you ask to each other because I'm sure the audience, both online and here, they have questions for you as well. Axel, starting with you, what is one question you want to ask John?
I've been thinking a lot about this idea of discursive bridges, and I've got a lot of sympathy for it. I think it's a really interesting, and it resonates with me because I think it links with a number of aspects that I'm interested in as well. In some ways, I keep thinking back to things like third spaces. The idea that there are kind of apolitical spaces, venues, whether it's online or offline, where people who are otherwise perhaps from very different ideologies, from very different backgrounds, meet around a different and kind of an apolitical or not as political topic. I've been talking, I think, John, a little bit mentioned sports, for instance. People might come together around a shared interest in sports when they're politically perhaps from very different perspectives. So I think utilizing those third spaces as a place where a kind of a diverse group of people meet, and occasionally we'll talk politics as well, but we'll talk politics in a way that enables each other to save face and to maintain friendliness because they're fundamentally there for a different reason. These are the spaces I'm interested in where discursive bridges I think can be built. One of the questions for me is, how do we identify them? Is there a way to more systematically kind of identify, well, where might these bridges exist? Where, if you are trying to really build that kind of deliberative engagement between people from different sides, how do you pick your winners? How do you pick the places where that's perhaps most likely to be possible and to be fruitful?
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I think Axel has certainly alerted me to the importance of third spaces, and actually we were talking earlier about Eurovision as a potential third space beyond sports, and I mean, I suppose, yeah, thinking about how do we pick them? I think that's really hard. I think they're much easier to identify in retrospect. So I think in response to the question last week in my talk, I referred to the example of Gary Lineker in the UK and getting people interested in football to talk about both the asylum seekers issue and also questions of free speech. What rights did he have as a presenter on the football program on the BBC to engage in political speech, not in terms of when he was presenting, but on Twitter. So that's so you can identify sort of positive examples in retrospect. But I suppose you can also identify negative examples when it comes to sport. So I was thinking of I used to live in Glasgow and in Scotland, where one of the teams, Rangers, is Protestant, the other is Celtic is Irish Catholic, and so their sport seems to magnify the divisions between two communities. So I think it's very hard to sort of identify, say you can't just say, well, football is good because it enables people from different political sides to come together. Well, sometimes they do. Sometimes they might come together. As in the case of Celtic and Rangers, actually sometimes physically violent, as well as just reinforcing identity differences. very hard to generalize. I think all we can do is just look at particular cases and try and figure out their attributes.
Thanks, John. So, what is your one question to Axel?
Yeah, I think I was thinking of a parallel between some of the stuff that Axel has been doing on the digital public sphere and sort of the classic Habermasian, Jürgen Habermas work on the structural transformation of the public sphere, which of course looks back over several hundred years of history. But if we look at the current transformation of the digital public sphere of the sort that actually you were talking about, changes in Twitter, in Facebook, and so forth, and those transformations seem to have big political consequences. But I was just wondering the extent to which are these transformations a result of just structural forces of some sort? Is there something, not necessarily technological determinism, but maybe economic centering or whatever? Or to what extent is it just simply a question of agency? That it's just, say, with Twitter, is it just Elon Musk just taking over and deciding to move it in some pretty awful directions?
It's both. It's both. I mean, these platforms have always been very much co-constructed between the platform operators and the users. It's the users whose emerging and continuously evolving practices of use also continue to shape the platforms, because the platform operators, of course, respond in some way also to what the users are doing when they introduce new features or remove old features that aren't being used and so on. And the users sometimes work very much against the grain of what the platform operators would actually want them to be doing. So they will protest new features, or they will just use them in very unexpected ways. So in many ways, this you can look at any social media platform and you'll see that tug of war essentially between platform operators and users back and forth, trying to define what these platforms are for, what they're about, how they should be used, what the appropriate use practices are, whether the platform operators are operating them in the way that the users want them to. And we're seeing, I think, a lot of that actually playing out with Twitter and Musk at the moment, because there's plenty of users who've been pushing back very strongly against what Musk has been doing, of course. Now, in his case, he's not necessarily going to take much notice of that, or he'll try and spin it in some other way. But in the past, we've certainly seen platform operators really respond to that and saying, well, in order to keep growing our platform, to maintain our user base, we'll have to make certain changes. We'll have to kind of meet them somewhere, maybe not quite halfway, but somewhere along the way. So there is this ongoing co-construction that's going on. That to some extent is also, of course, or can also be manipulated by those who shout the loudest, frankly, or who generate enough bots or enough fake accounts to make themselves really visible. So there's a lot of other stuff going on that isn't simply a level playing field kind of argument between genuine users and the platform operators, but there's also a lot of further interference by not necessarily commercial or state interests, but simply by just groups of users who create multiple accounts and interference and form. But there is this ongoing sort of tug of war between the two sides, and I think this is, of course, in some ways constrained, all of this, by the cost and the complexity of running large universal platforms. And plenty of users, plenty of people who've had some level of technical ability have tried to sort of build their own platforms. And Mastodon, in some ways, is also an example of that. Very often they don't go very far, because to scale this up from just a handful of people who think this is a good idea and this is how we should work, to something that genuinely can sustain hundreds of millions of users is, of course, difficult, to say the least. So, we've had a PhD student at QUT who studied a platform called DTube, Ashwin Nagapa, who studied a platform called DTube, which was meant to be a decentralized alternative to YouTube, basically. It hasn't necessarily gone very well, it hasn't attracted a large audience, but it's an interesting model for how to build a kind of a YouTube alternative that's operated by its users in a perhaps more collaborative, constructive way. But that's difficult, and there's not many examples of this having succeeded in replacing a commercially run, very hierarchically organized, commercial venture basically as a social media platform.
Great, thanks, John and Axel. There's a lot of argumentative complexity in your responses. And maybe you introduce yourself briefly. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Caroline Fisher. I'm from the News and Media Research Centre. Thank you both for your individual talks and for today. I mean, one of the other commonalities was just this shared concern about this environment of information overload. And I guess, further listening to today, this idea of discursive bridges as a possible solution. But is it the solution if in this age of information overload, fragmenting audiences, multi-channel, hybrid environment, there is no one public sphere? I mean, is this idea of increasing complexity actually far too idealistic? How are we going to increase complexity when it's very difficult to find spaces to build these bridges? Do we need to look for a less complex answer, a less complex answer to trying to improve debate?
That's fair. So, Mike?
Mike Jensen, National Security BGO. I was interested in the first part of the discussion on affective polarization, particularly, Axel, what you're talking about, one potential solution being that focus on concrete problems which might transcend partisan divides. Like there isn't much of a partisan discussion about fixing potholes or other daily aspects. The counter to that being that that's sometimes limited nonetheless by certain identity dynamics. Now, if Henrik Bang were here, he'd probably talk about this difference between input politics and demands for identity recognition and so forth versus output politics, which have what Castells calls more project-focused identity. Might it be that if we think in those terms, identities perhaps are relationally cued as opposed to something that is altered, except perhaps in the case of like the Proud Boys individual who doesn't accept the right of somebody else to exist. And at that point, then we can think about discursive bridges just being the variety of tools that might come into play in any particular situation, whereby people can arrive at solutions for common problems.
I mean, David.
Okay. So David Nolan, also from the News and Media Research Centre. Just probably connecting with what Caroline was asking around this kind of question of discursive bridges, because it seems to me that works very well as a kind of individual kind of civic ethic. But then when you're thinking about that as the basis for the public square, then you've got that's where you're faced with a much bigger problem. And particularly kind of the thing that I was kind of worrying about, and I don't think it was on the list of things not to worry about, was the fact that there is such political and commercial capital in divisive politics. And so how to overcome that, particularly, if Axel, your solution for journalism is to hold people to account where they're struggling for capital, and so they're kind of chasing capital, and they're looking for where capital can be made in this ecosystem. I'm thinking here about kind of, your work around 5G towers and kind of, the kind of Christian Vicari work around, do tabloids poison the well of social media, the way in which that hybrid space is kind of contributing to quite a problematic public square in our time. So whether that can be reformed through kind of moving in that direction.
Brief responses from Axel and John. Axel, starting with you.
Okay. So maybe to Caroline first, should we increase complexity? I don't know that we should deliberately increase complexity, but I think we need to resist the reduction of complexity beyond meaningful bounds. I mean, there's a point in some areas to reduce complexity. I mean, there's, let's say, climate change. There's no longer a need to have complex arguments about whether climate change exists. I think that's settled. So we can reduce that to its simplest common denominator. Yes, we need to do something about climate change. What we need to do about it that's the more complex. And simply picking a solution, saying that's going to fix it. Green hydrogen's going to fix it. That's not going to be the answer. So I think, yeah, it's not necessarily about increasing complexity, but also just pointing out where something is just reduced to below acceptable levels of complexity, if that makes sense. But I think I'll go with David next. You're right. There's a lot of commercial capital in division itself, in sowing division. That's also a problem, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I think the problem is that there is probably more money to be made at this point sowing division by creating a cheap to run kind of InfoWars type thing, basically, until you get sued for billions of dollars. But and it's more expensive to run the New York Times, obviously, to run a proper news organization. There is no easy solution, I think, to that structural imbalance. It's opinion's always cheaper than journalism, basically. And yeah, I don't have a magic bullet for that, unfortunately. But I think yeah, I might just leave it there in the interest of time. But you're right. That's a really one of the fundamental problems that we're dealing with this way. Mike, I think you're right that some issues lend themselves much more to finding a kind of the apolitical debate than others, and I think that again that's a really really useful reminder for us. I think also that some issues are identity based and identity driven, and the identity question shouldn't be eroded from that. I think, and in some cases we cannot simply find that sort of the kind of the purely process-oriented kind of question of, well, what should we do about this problem without taking into account the fundamental and historical inequalities that exist and keeping them as part of the thing. I think that probably doesn't quite answer your more complex question, but I might just leave it there in the interest of time.
Anything you'd like to add on?
Yeah, just in response to what Caroline was saying, one point you said that there's no one public sphere. Well, maybe that's always been true, but I think it's still possible to think in terms of the public sphere as a whole. And we'll actually get some support from Axel here, but at least appeal to Axel's what he said about the lack of existence of echo chambers and filter bubbles. That suggests that the public sphere is not necessarily as fragmented as we might think. So in that sense, prospects for discursive bridging become perhaps slightly better. On Mike's question about different cues and the importance of what I would agree that it's possible to selectively invoke different identities. So I don't know, somebody might have a different identity as a football team they support, the political party they support, and their ethnicity, and so forth. And those things can all be invoked selectively. It's just a question of what sorts of appeals can be made, and one which can work. And then that I think that's also, it sort of relates to David's question about divisive politics. And yes, there are people who can prosper from divisive politics. But there are also choices to be made, and we can look at different historical cases of different leaders, different political leaders who've made very different sorts of choices in that respect. I mean, it's possible to point to populist demagogues, to nationalist demagogues who've thrived on division and demonization on the other side. But it's also possible to point to people who, in similar sorts of situations, have made very different choices. I mentioned the case of Northern Ireland earlier, and eventually leaders on different sides, including the more extreme leaders on different sides, who've been involved with paramilitary groups, eventually adopted more inclusive language and didn't seek to prosper as demagogues. So yes, people, particular leaders, can prosper from division, but it's also possible for leaders to make different choices.
Thanks, John. Matt, can we get 2-3 pressing questions from the online audience, please?
Sure, we've got two from Matteo from NMRC. This was near the start of the seminar. Said perhaps not just about identity, but about how one deals with attitude challenging content. E.g., some people find online environments will reject attitude challenging content out of hand, whereas other people, online environments will be more likely to engage with the argument based on the authority of the stronger argument. And here the second question for Axel RE platforms. It has been shown that since the introduction of more diverse emoticons on Facebook, it has been shown that content which makes people angry has been prioritised by the platforms. Anger drives stronger engagement, so platforms definitely have a role. We've got another question from Hedda Ranson Cooper from ANU. Question for both. On the problem of argumentative simplification, why is it that the progressive side of politics seem to do this so poorly in regards to tackling big problems? Isn't there a role for these in building a movement? E.g., I believe her. Simple catchphrases that rally and hook people around unpacking some more of the complexity. And then a comment from Kelly from the University of Canberra, this is the last one. Affective polarisation reveals the highly emotional nature of patriarchal society. The myth of traditional dichotomies of rational emotional, public private. Care ethics is perhaps a useful frame, teaching complexity and ambiguity.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. So really great questions. Very brief answers on and the questions seem to be on the same topic. So the topics we've been talking about. So in that sense, please be sort of pick whatever you like to respond in the interest of the time.
I think I'll focus on the Facebook emoticons one because it's an interesting one. I haven't really thought about it in that sense, but it's a good example of both the platform maybe responding to the requests from users to say, well, actually, we want more than just the thumbs up. Maybe give us some other options here. But then also using that extra, more detailed input to shape its algorithms around that, and then perhaps work out, hey, yeah, the hateful stuff gets much more engagement, so let's push that hateful content higher and make it more visible. I mean, assuming that's what's happened internally in Facebook. I don't want to cast aspersions here, but I think that's that sort of interplay between users and platforms. So users saying, yeah, let's have that, and then platforms give that to them, but then also turn that into something else again, basically. There's been similar debates around being able to edit your tweets on Twitter, of course, where yeah, that's in principle that's great, but it also might mean that some hateful person could post something really hateful, have that up there for a few seconds, and then edit it, and you don't know anymore that this was actually hate speech. So the way that any of these sorts of technological interventions in platform can also be used and abused and repurposed in different ways again. The emoticons on Facebook are a good example of that. As good an example as any.
Yeah. John?
Okay, maybe I'll just respond to the other two questions. I think Hedda's suggestion that maybe simple catchphrases have a place. I think, well, maybe they do. But as the beginning of thinking through problems rather than the end, it's when, I suppose the problem is when the catchphrase is build a wall or whatever is the end of the story. And then the third person, I didn't quite catch the name of the
Hedda Ranson Cooper?
No, yeah, it was
Kelly from
Kelly, okay. Yeah, on the question of care ethics, I think I think there's something to be said for care, an ethic of care. There's also a lot to be said that it's not enough. Maybe this sort of also relates to the question of empathy, which I believe also caring for those, caring for others, and both sort of finding something in them in which to relate to. That I mean, there's sort of debate within the Deliberative Democracy community as to whether empathy is actually a good guide. More important, perhaps, is recognizing and listening to those with whom we cannot empathise, which is more important. So I think an ethic of care only goes so far.
Thanks, John. So I'll be collecting the last round of 3 questions from the room. Sahana, I know your hand has been up, so starting with Sahana.
So I'm kind of interested in discursive bridges, but in a society, in a post-conflict society, where the central node of the conflict itself might have been ethnic, religious, communal identities, because we spoke about polarization based on ideology and political parties. But how do you step back from ethnic and religious identities?
Simon.
Thank you both very much for a very interesting and rich and complex conversation about the issues around the public sphere. And as a scholar in this space who's sort of written by anxiety himself and dealing with the complexity of these issues, it's very easy to find some paralysed in space. So the first part of the question is, how do we deal with that in actually sort of addressing some of these issues? And I sort of wanted to raise sort of an example of what we're dealing with here in terms of thinking about what's being discussed today. So the idea of bridging rhetoric, okay, which is a great idea, but the problem is there is so much complexity, and there's it's so multi-causal and so many different elements and different levels and so on. So it's very hard to abstract. So one of the problems there, of course, is that it works, but then you need the situation where there's an incentive to engage in that sort of behaviour, and of course, in Australian politics in particular, whenever I talk to pundits and so on, talk about local change politics, there's a risk involved in this. If you actually change your style, there's an incentive, in the way we structure our politics to not engage in that, which actually relates to the situation around partisanship. I mean, there's a logic in engaging partisan rhetoric, in terms of it's a systemic problem. And John raised the issue of systemic issues related to, say, environmental change. And the thing that really strikes me about this is that complexity is stress-inducing in itself. Observed changes that induces stress, and there's a lot of social psychology that speaks to what this does to our cognition, the need for certainty, the need for cognitive closure as a concept here, complexity. Engaging complexity is important, but it is difficult, and it's also a big ask. And it strikes me that one of the challenges we need is to actually reduce that cognitive load, that complexity among the public, which then raises the issue of trust, in terms of trust and judgment and so on. But how do we do this? I'm just wondering if we actually need to go. And this is my question: whether we actually go even deeper and actually look at this in more kind of comprehensive and radical terms. But how do we do that in terms of dealing with the complexities involved?
Thanks. Final question from the room. Yes.
And my question is, what role do governments play in intervening in the marketplace of ideas, to removing some of the economic incentives that give advantages to players who might be interested in driving that divisive and identity-based political speech or hate speech in the place?
John, starting with you this time.
Okay. Right. So Hannah's question on discursive bridges in post-conflict society, when ethnic identity questions are an issue. Well, I mean, actually, this goes back to one thing I suggested earlier, and actually Axel suggested about book 2 about starting with concrete problems. And there we do have examples of deliberative processes being introduced in post-conflict societies. So Jörg Steiner, our late Swiss colleague, did a lot of work in places like former Yugoslavia, Colombia, and in Colombia brought together people who had been killing each other, trying to kill each other, right-wing paramilitaries and leftist guerrillas, and yeah, I mean, and did have a degree of success in creating, at least in those sorts of in creating bridges across the two sides, so it can be done. On Simon's suggestion about complexity being potentially paralysing in light of the need for cognitive closure, my answer to that would simply be to say that we need systems that cope with complexity. It doesn't mean we impose the burden of coping with complexity on particular individuals and just bringing different individuals, different life experiences, different angles on issues together in deliberative settings is one way of producing a collective response to complexity, which doesn't require that particular individuals cope with the entirety of the issue themselves. And then third question on role of government in regulating speech. Well, that's a sort of traditional question in political theory, I suppose, the degree to which governments in liberal societies should regulate speech, and we have lots of different answers on that. I'm not sure if it's possible to sort of resolve those debates in a simple way, but clearly, sort of different societies regulate speech in different ways. So in some European countries, Holocaust denial is an offence, for example. In other countries in different settings, well, it's not. I mean, it's not such a big issue. I think that's what I said.
Thank you. I might do them in reverse order. I think that question I understood maybe a little bit differently from what John answered, but the question of how to incentivize, I guess, more constructive ways of contributing to public debate. So this kind of goes back a little bit to what I said to David. Publishing opinion is always cheaper than publishing, news, because you have to do less work to have an opinion than to research a news story. So is there a way to, literally tweak the market to make, to subsidize news production and devalue the production of opinion? Probably not totally, but of course there are plenty of schemes being tried around the world to subsidize quality news for us. Some better than others, and I don't even want to mention the NBC, but there's a bunch of different approaches basically to try and subsidize the production of quality news. And maybe we can think somehow of schemes also to support, in a sense, I don't know what the word is, quality politics over populist politics. So it's also cheaper to be a populist than it is to be a politician who actually is trying to develop policy, I guess, is really what I'm trying to say. So again, is there a way to remove subsidies from the Clive Palmers of this world and provide subsidies to, well, I don't know, pick your politician in Australia who might be the other example of that. So that to me was kind of perhaps the answer to the question that I heard from you. I think we heard that question perhaps slightly differently. And that kind of goes maybe to Simon's question as well about, what are the incentives actually to build bridges, and what are the incentives, if you like, to do the difficult things, which is to talk in a complex way rather than to have 3-word slogans saying build the wall or, end the carbon tax or whatever else it might be. So again, how do we, and this isn't all, I think, government, it's also their social sanctions. There's the way that media report about it as well, of course. Any and all of these interventions are important to valorize, if you like, meaningful, if complex contributions to public debate over meaningless but simple contributions to public debate. And then, Sahana, that's a really important, really, really difficult question in a society that was totally, riven by ethnic conflict or other really, really deep-set conflicts. Of course, it's much harder to build bridges. The only meaningful answer I really have here is to really look for where are the touch points? Where is it that these communities that are so different and so split apart in any other way, is there any common ground that they have? Is there any place where they come together, be it around entertainment, be it around sports, be it around something else that they both care deeply about, and where perhaps the conflict, where what they care about isn't loaded up with their ethnic or other identity. So is there anywhere where these people come together and have any kind of normal kind of conversation with each other without it being overloaded by you're that and I'm that and we can't speak to each other? Whatever that might be, there may be, and this is sort of from my perspective, there may well be some empirical approaches to looking at that as well, by observing, for instance, the way that they communicate online and seeing where there are perhaps overlaps between these communities where, members of this community, members of that community actually exist in the same space together and talk amongst each other as if they're not, they're not at each other's throats and everything else, basically. So there might be some empirical answers to that as well, actually identifying those overlaps between those communities. And that might be a starting point. That might be then how you identify where trying to build bridges is going to be most fruitful.
Thank you, Matt. Is there any questions online?
Yeah.
So any one final super pressing question in the room? No, okay. Anything, John or Axel, you wished you had said, but any final remarks?
Actually, one thing on the just on the very last question on the role of government, and which Axel and I heard a bit differently. In terms of media systems do vary significantly between different countries, and there's I'm trying to think there's the contrast sometimes between liberal media system in which basically everything is driven by private profit, and then I'm trying to remember what the contrasting type is to that, but it's where government plays a much bigger role in doing things like things like the ABC or the BBC in the UK. Just the idea that there is also a public interest in quality media. Then that the UK is a bit different because you have a liberal free for all when it comes to newspapers, often to very detrimental effect on the public sphere. We have the BBC as a counterweight to that. So media systems do differ between different countries, and the role of government seems to be very, very different as well. And there are some countries which do have a much more interventionist tradition with things like the BBC or ABC.
Thanks, John. Axel, any final?
I mean, look, for me, really, the one thing I'm most interested in pursuing further is that question of bridge building. I do think, and this is sort of again why I said this to Sam as well, I think there is a really empirical question there as well about trying to identify those areas. And I think some of, John, what you're talking about is actually about, in a really practical sense, certainly online, is about network analysis, is about trying to see how individuals who are engaged in a broad range of public debate, where they come together, when in other cases they're absolute enemies and absolutely separate from each other. And to some extent it's about context collapse. And that's really kind of trying to identify those areas of context collapse where people who otherwise are defining themselves in totally different ways are actually kind of crashing into each other because they have something in common. And that identifying that thing or those things that they have in common, that to me is one of the answers, one of the pathways forward.
I agree. So thank you so much to both of our guest speakers today. A couple of closing remarks from me. So replays of all 3 seminars, including today's, are available on our YouTube channel. And then I would like to thank to Nicole Curato and Katerina Esau for leading the collaboration between the 3 research centers and for conceptualizing this seminar series. Then I would also like to thank to Krista Schmeling, Matt Harris for organizing our in-person events today here, and to Ferdinand Sanchez online for organizing and looking after the online audiences for us. Everyone is welcome to join us for lunch downstairs and continue the conversation. Thank you so much for coming along.